I'd like to introduce Mr. Rafael Escandon, one of our GM1 board members, who will be going over the ABCs and 1, 2, 3s of investigational success.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Rafael Escandon, Rafa. I've been on the Cure GM1 board for the past 2 or so years. I've known Christine for a while. Like Gori, have a long background in rare disease, drug enzyme replacement, and gene therapy development. I've been working in there for the past 10 or 12 years. I am first a scientist, but then secondly a bioethicist by training, and so I'm going to focus today, give you a few landmarks about clinical trials, about and then other types of access as well. There have been lots of different names and acronyms and numbers and all sorts of stuff that's been presented here today, but what I'm going to try to do a little bit is to ground us on the differences between research and treatment. Number one is sort of a fundamental, and then secondly, how parents, investigators, and families can discuss whether or not accessing whether it's an enzyme replacement, whether it's a gene therapy, whether it's whether it's a ASO, whether it's CRISPR, a gene edit, whether that's the right thing for your family to engage in. So lots of different modalities here. Excuse me, and I think these slides will be available, and I'm always available to discuss some of the similarities and differences. So I don't want to throw too much jargon at you. So the first thing I want to talk about is something that I think it's really boring to think through nomenclature, right? I think anybody, if you're a scientist or you're a physician and you had to take organic chemistry, I think that was as an undergraduate, I think that was your first real exposure to tapping your memory. The first thing they ask you to do is to just learn nomenclature, the language of that particular discipline in chemistry. And I think nomenclature is really important here as a fundamental, because from an ethical point of view and from a practical point of view, the differences and the objectives between research and treatment are really, really, really different. And I think the two get conflated quite often within the context of clinical trials. And so I just want to throw down a few differences and specifics here just to keep us grounded, as I said. So just starting on the right side of the diagram for you, research in purple. The purpose of research is to answer questions. Fundamentally, there are unknowns, and so you generate knowledge by conducting the experiment. That can be an experiment like Gori described in her laboratory, or it can be the laboratory can be the clinic or the series of clinics that hospitals in a multi-center clinical trial are participating in. But the real issue there is that you're actually a question is being asked, and by yourself or your child or a patient's participation in that research, data are being generated that will help to answer a question. But the primary objective is to generate those data to generate generalizable knowledge. Things are different about research as well in terms of flexibility. There's a protocol. Research is sort of the oversight of research is done according to an ethics committee when it's done in humans, and the decision making is really made by the clinical investigator, but really according to the research protocol to limit variability that can be introduced in sort of the everyday world. Flipping over to the green side, treatment is something that happens, that David does every day in the ICU, for example. Everything he does has been tested in terms of and adopted in terms of treatment guidelines, medical guidelines by medical societies that say this is the standard of care. This is how we do things on an evidence-based basis. And so it's really very much more the physician-directed judgment and experience and professional guidelines that really manage that process. And so physicians make choices about what interventions they use in any particular case based on what the data tell them about that particular patient, but it's really up to them. And the oversight is really an evidence basis, standards of care, and medical practice in the treatment. So again, the two are really, really different. They do converge in the clinic, but I think it's really important as parents and participants to remember is that when you're in a clinical trial, it's research. It's not proven yet, and the whole objective is to generate. If our hypothesis from the preclinical stage is correct, then that may manifest in some benefit, but there's no guarantee by participating in a clinical trial that there will be some benefit, which is a harsh reality, but a hard reality. It's something that's very important to remember. And it comes back to your thinking as parents or participants yourselves that to ask the question, is this trial and the burdens and everything that's required of this trial, is this the right thing, not just for my child or myself, but for my whole family? And that's really the fundamental that I want to emphasize here. So enough nomenclature, enough sort of grounding in principles. In practice, what are some of the access points for investigational interventions? Well, as you can see, there's just a whole bunch of different, this isn't even all of them, but starting at the top, there's the typical sponsored clinical trial, sponsored by a company, a single protocol that's often done in many centers around the country or around the world. There are also, like Dr. Tift's study that was mentioned earlier, her study is an investigator-initiated trial under her own IND that's being done at the National Institutes of Health. There are other formulations of trials and treatment like expanded access, compassionate use. Those two names get thrown around. They're very similar, but they're slightly different. Pre-approval access, very very similar as well. And then since the first Trump administration, you've probably heard about this now national law of right to try. And I'll go through a little bit about what the differences in some of these things are. Busy table here, but one that I think is really worthwhile. And if you ever have questions about it, I'm happy to answer. So just each column here going from left to right, from clinical trial, which is the typical what you hear about when there's a multi-center study going on that's sponsored either by a company or by an institution like the NIH. That's really what you're thinking what you're thinking about when you think about a multi-center study, single protocol, a single physician at your particular site that's responsible for that, and things are all done in a uniform way across all the participants. The FDA oversees those in the United States, the same for Europe. Each individual country has its own approval basis. Ethics committees approve it. There are very detailed qualification eligibility criteria for those. The ultimate objective is to get approval, so full data collections are done. The advantages of that, of course, is that it's very structured research and ultimately should result in if the data go the way that are hoped, in an approval. The limitations, of course, is that it's not everyone will qualify, and so those rigid inclusion criteria almost always make clinical trials go more slowly than you hope, especially when in conditions like GM1 where time is of the essence. Investigator-initiated studies, I won't go down every element here, but they're very similar to a typical clinical trial that will result in either an approval or further development. They tend to be initiated a little bit sooner and don't really go generally don't go beyond sort of middle phases of development. And then the other two elements, the other two categories I have on this slide are really related to access that's outside the context of either of those two clinical trials. So expanded access or compassionate use, and then the national legislation that was passed during Trump 1 in 2018 is called Right to Try. I will just sort of interject my own biases here. I don't personally, very few companies, there's still just a very, very small number in the 7 years since Right to Try was adopted nationally. Very few examples of patients that have accessed an investigational product outside of a clinical trial based on that. It's well branded, I would say, but it's actually misnamed. It's really a right to ask. It is not there is no fundamental right to try, but you have a right to ask. And through your physician, if collectively you think that there's a potential benefit, I would ask through the expanded access pathway, which is very well worn with the FDA. There's an FDA review in that. There's an ethics committee approval involved in that. There are eligibility criteria. It must be, which is certainly GM1 or subtypes of GM1 qualify for that in terms of a life-threatening condition, no other approved products, no eligibility for a clinical trial. Small amounts of data are collected, kind of comes around usually after phase 1, so early to mid-stage development. And access can be approved fairly quickly, but again, it requires a petition to a physician who agrees to administer this in a relatively structured way. There has to be drug supply. Several boxes need to be ticked. It never goes as quickly as you'd like, but it can be a relatively straightforward way to access an investigational agent. So again, happy. I don't want to go into every nuance here, but I'm happy to discuss those two. And then this is just a little bit more detail on the ins and outs of how to get in. So must be serious and life-threatening for expanded access. No alternatives. The potential benefits must outweigh the risks, and you can't be eligible for a current clinical trial. So again, the process is across the bottom here. And then the last thing I want to talk about is gene therapy, and I think Dr. Ra's presentation is really important in terms of there's an extra thing to think about in terms of gene therapy, and I talk in the ethics community about this a lot. Gene therapies get lumped into the category of drug quite often, and far too often in my opinion, and I think the one or few extra elements about gene therapies that you as parents or participants really need to think about is that gene therapies, at least viral mediated gene therapies, viral vector based gene therapies, can only currently be given once. And so depending on when and how you or your child will participate in a clinical trial, that's a very big distinction. It can't be turned up, can't be turned down, can't be turned off, can't be taken away, and that's just a much heavier burden on decision making that I think that families need to think about, and sort of categorizing these as drugs does that unfairly. So, to me as an ethicist, I've really put these more into a category of a transplant, like a solid organ transplant, versus a drug that you can turn off, turn up, turn down, take away. So just a lot more to think about in the gene therapy world. That may change. We hope it will in the future, and but it's some additional element to think about. And so again, just just to sort of summarize, there are access points. I recommend expanded access to investigational products if your child doesn't qualify for a protocol, but that will have to be mediated, and I recommend mediating that through speaking to your doctor and their willingness to potentially participate in asking the FDA to access it under a expanded access context. And that's it. Joe, just one more thing to say. I know I'm short on time here, but the final thing to say about this is that companies are required to disclose their expanded access policy on their websites once the drug or the gene therapy makes it into the phase 2 into phase 2 development. And the final thing I'll say is that to plug, not just to plug a colleague, but Ultragenics has, I think, the absolute best summary of that on their website for expanded access. So I highly recommend folks go have a look at Ultragenics' website on how they describe and break down their explanation of expanded access. It's really, really, really great. The FDA's website is as well, so don't be afraid to poke around there. All right, and that's it for me, so thank you very much.